Hello everyone, I'm delighted to be here today to introduce the first of our series of Bob InC sessions. For those of you who don't know, Bob InC stands for Bob in Conversation. So these conversations are a really important part of the leadership pillar of our OD work, and they're designed to support all of us in our learning and development, to help us build connections across Bob, and to create a culture where we can have open and honest discussions about all of the brilliant and challenging things that come with working in a complex system. So today's session is focusing on leadership, and I'm delighted to have our Chief Executive here. So Nick, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yep, Philippa, thank you for that. Hello everyone, I'm Nick Broughton and I am the Chief Executive of the Integrated Care Board.
Welcome Nick, and thank you for being the guinea pig for this new format. So I'm especially pleased to be starting this conversation on the topic of leadership, as we are all leaders in Bob. You never stop learning and developing as a leader, I'm sure you will attest, and it's not something you can learn from a book. So as important as it is to have formal L&D on leadership and to familiarise yourself with leadership theory and different leadership styles, there's so much to learn from just talking to each other and talking to different people with leadership experiences. So Nick, over to you. First of all, how are you feeling about this session and talking about leadership?
Well, I'm looking forward to it actually.
Excellent.
It's something a bit different in the diary this week, and I'm very keen to try and support leadership development across our organisation, and hopefully inspire colleagues to take on greater leadership responsibilities.
Yeah, that's great. I really agree with that, and I think these kind of conversations can really help people to understand what it feels like to be a leader and how you deal with those challenges. So with that kind of development theme in mind, it would be really helpful to sort of start at your early years, your really early years. Did you always want to be a leader in the NHS? What did Nick Broughton at age 9 want to be when he grew up?
So I always wanted to be a doctor, being frank.
Really?
Going back to when I was a tiny kid,
Yeah.
I remember being given a sort of doctor's kit for Christmas one year. I must have been about 4 or 5. And that rather sowed the seed in my mind that medicine might be the career for me.
Wow.
And that developed over time. And certainly by the time I got to secondary school, I was very focused on the idea of becoming a doctor. Initially, I thought I was going to become a surgeon.
Mm-hmm.
Not quite sure why.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't particularly practical.
Mm-hmm.
I was the sort of kid who'd start to build an airfix model and wouldn't really get beyond sticking the wings onto the fuselage. And then when I was at medical school, it became apparent that I wasn't a naturally gifted surgeon. And then had a really good experience actually in psychiatry as part of one of my attachments. Loved the patient contact, the opportunity to get to know people, the focus on communication, and that sowed the seed in my mind that I wanted to become a psychiatrist. But certainly at that stage, I hadn't thought about taking on sort of senior leadership responsibilities, and that developed once I became a consultant, I suppose.
And did anyone in your family, was anyone you knew in medicine, or was it something you were kind of striding out into on your own?
I had a couple of cousins who were married to doctors, but that was it really. Yeah, so I was very much the first.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So tell us about your early career then. So medicine degree, and then was it straight into psychiatry?
Yeah, it was. So that was back in the day of house jobs. So I did 2 house jobs, one in medicine, one in surgery, and I went into those already thinking about psychiatry as a possible career avenue, and during those 12 months really firmed up my thinking I wanted to become a psychiatrist. So joined a training scheme in West London as a senior house officer, as was, and did 3 years of general training, 6 months of old age, 6 months of learning disability, 6 months of general adult, etc. But also 6 months of forensic psychiatry, which I really enjoyed. And that was the thing that really appealed to me. So then got on the higher training scheme for forensic psychiatry, which was based in West London, but also included detachments at Broadmoor Special Hospital down in Crowthorne. So did that and became a consultant, gosh, over 20 odd years ago now.
Wow.
And yeah, embarked my consultant career in what was the Three Bridges Regional Secure Unit in West London.
Wow, that sounds really intense. I'm sure people would like to hear a bit more about that sort of Broadmoor experience, but I'm also interested in what leadership felt like to you in those early years. So particularly in psychiatry, what kind of clinical leadership did you get, good and bad? What were your experiences?
Yeah, so psychiatry is a very multidisciplinary specialty, and you don't deliver mental health care just as a psychiatrist. It's very much a whole team approach. So throughout my psychiatric training, I worked in teams and worked very closely with other members of the team, whether they be occupational therapists, physiotherapists, psychologists, social workers, nurses, obviously, other doctors. And that was really helpful because it helped embed in me a really strong ethos of team working. And I worked in some good teams and I worked in some not so good teams. And what really stood out to me were the teams which were high performing and what underpinned those team cultures, and a real focus on engaging everyone, valuing everyone's opinion, creating the right sort of conditions whereby people felt able to contribute to clinical decision making. And I would like to think that's rather underpinned my approach to being the chief executive.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've not worked in any kind of clinical role, but I think my perception would be that clinical leadership would be more about that sort of command and control model and, you know, a different type of decision making. But that sounds like more of a kind of MDT inclusive
Very
approach.
much so, very much so. And clearly, particularly in my world of forensic psychiatry, you were making some fairly important decisions about, whether someone could go on leave for the first time, having been transferred from prison following committing a very serious crime. And ultimately the buck stopped with the responsible clinician who was the consultant. But my approach was that you wanted everyone to be able to contribute to those clinical decisions, and effectively you share the risk, and you make better decisions when everyone's involved and everyone can contribute. So I was very keen for it not to be hierarchical, not for it to be command and control, but for a more sort of collective approach.
So there's that sense of, you're kind of protecting and supporting each other in that risk that you carry, but ultimately you're very clear in who's responsible for taking those decisions.
There were clear lines of accountability, I suppose, but there was a culture whereby the view of the team was very important, and you encourage people to challenge. And I'm one of the best teams I worked in. I remember the ward domestic has been on that ward for a long time, and she knew the patients very well because our patients were with us for quite a long time, and she'd clean their bedrooms. So she would have insights into how they were coping, what they were doing, which I wouldn't have. I didn't spend time sort of rooting through their bedrooms and making sure everything was clean and tidy. And she felt able to come to me and say, "Nick, I'm really worried about Mr. So-and-so because I've just noticed that his bedroom is nowhere near as tidy as it used to be." And those insights helped inform my thinking and the wider team's thinking about how well people were, what support they needed, whether there was a case to change medication, etc. And it was a great example of the importance of team dynamics, but also linked to that the importance of culture, and having the right culture. And again, that applies to our organisation. We want to have the right culture.
Absolutely. And in those more junior roles, when you were still learning,
I'm still learning.
We're all still learning every day, absolutely. But particularly when I was a more junior member of staff, I sometimes I'd carried more anxiety about mistakes because you don't have the experience to understand how things play out. Is that something you experienced? How did you kind of build your resilience in those early years while you're still learning?
I think one of the things that underpins good doctors is the ability to realise when you need to ask for help, and when you are faced by a challenge, a problem, a question that is outside your expertise. And I held on to that. And it obviously becomes more difficult the more senior you become, because people assume you know all the answers. Often you don't. But there's normally people around in the services you work in who do have slightly more expertise in certain areas. So not being afraid to ask and expose your limitations, weakness, I think is very important. And that was something I held to, and I remember vividly at times, being faced by difficult situations clinically and asking others for advice, guidance, and exposing my own lack of knowledge in certain areas. I think you're working in organisations which have the right culture, which encourage you to put your hand up if you are in need of support, and where there isn't a focus on blame if things go wrong.
Yeah, that's really important.
Oh, most definitely.
It's really important what people learn from having reached out. So if they learn that they get support, then that will build that muscle around reaching out. But if they learn that they get told off, or they're blamed, or there's a long line of consequences that are unpleasant for them, they'll probably keep things to themselves, won't they?
Exactly. And what I knew, certainly in the organisation I worked in as a clinician, was that if I did what was asked of me, if the decisions I made were thought through, were well documented, that if things did go wrong, I would be supported. And clearly, if things go wrong because you haven't done your job and you've been negligent, well, then there's a case that you should be blamed, rightly. But I think there's an expectation, or there should be an expectation, certainly in our world of healthcare, that on occasions, despite people's best efforts, despite people's hard work, from time to time, because the unpredictable nature of what we're trying to manage, what we're trying to do, things will go wrong for down to no fault of anyone.
And that's when you need that learning culture, isn't it? And understanding why, yes, you might have made a bad decision, but there may be lots of other factors that impacted that, and understanding and learning from that, I think, is really important. And so can we move then, I'm interested to hear how you made the transition to, shall we say, corporate leadership from clinical leadership, and what motivated you to want to do that, and how did it feel, that change?
So I sort of dipped my toe in that I took on some educational responsibilities, and I quite liked the sort of the managerial aspect of that. I suppose that I do remember quite vividly my sort of epiphany. So I was at a consultants meeting, and it was around the time that the trust I was working in was debating whether it should take on responsibility for Broadmoor Hospital. And those of you who may remember the history of the high secure hospitals may remember they used to sit outside the main body of the NHS, and they were quite isolated, and as a consequence there were real concerns about what that meant for the culture in these hospitals, which were more akin to prisons back then than they were to hospitals. Anyway, on the back of that there was a move that the three special hospitals should be more closely aligned with the mainstream NHS. And the organisation I was working in was approached, and we were considering the merits of taking on responsibility for Broadmoor, which wasn't without risk. I remember going to a consultants meeting, and I was pretty junior. I'd only been a consultant for a couple of years, and I was a bit outspoken and was very critical of management. And I remember being in this meeting, just sort of lobbing in verbal grenades, and I imagined how I was perceived by the clinical director at the time as a sort of problem child. And I reflected on that meeting, and I thought, did I have the impact that I wanted to have? Was I being actually constructive? Did I just want to be someone who was perceived as being difficult? Or did I want to try and be part of the solution to some of these challenges? And I decided on the latter course of action, that it was very easy to find faults and criticise. It's far more difficult to actually accept responsibility and try and solve some of the complicated challenges that we had then and obviously continue to have. So that very much was the epiphany and the watershed moment for me. And then soon after there was an opportunity to apply to become a clinical director in the forensic service for what was then a fairly small part of the service. And I was encouraged to apply, was quite keen to apply, and was successful. And that's how it all started.
Great. And did you sort of, thinking back at that meeting when you were quite challenging, do you remember the impact you were having on other people? How did that resonate in the room?
I think sort of my more sort of militant colleagues rather liked it. And
playing to the gallery, perhaps.
Yeah, possibly. I think there was a sense of disappointment in other courses. And I think, because I was only, how old was I then? 32 probably. So I had a long career ahead of me. And I did think, what do I want to achieve? And, how do I want to be perceived by colleagues? And I was conscious that in the unit I was working in, there were a couple of disaffected souls who were, quite sort of long in the tooth. And they, they had really dreadful reputations. And I thought, really, that's not what I want to do. I'd like to leave a slightly better legacy than that.
I think it's a really interesting example, and thanks for being so honest about it, because I think, there's something that we all have to deal with around frustration sometimes in the workplace, and it's interesting to think about some of the choices that we will make about how we lean into that. And I think frustration is always telling you something, isn't it? There's something important that frustration points to that needs to change. And the question is about how do you work with people to affect that change and not let the frustration become, the default setting, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly.
And you want to work with others constructively, particularly, and we'll come on to this, I think, a bit in systems where we're constantly having to work with partners and figure out how we get the most out of them. At what point you then moved on to, at what point did you move on to Oxford Health and some of these very senior roles?
So I worked up my way up the sort of the medical leadership ladder, as it were, in this organisation in West London. Became medical director back in 2010 and was medical director for about 6 years before I moved on to my first chief exec role. And I sort of ummed and ahed about whether to become a chief exec. And I suppose I was relatively young to be a medical director. And then I started to wonder, well, it's not the sort of role you can do, for 20 odd years. It's only got a relatively defined shelf life. So I started to think about what I wanted to do thereafter. And I very much wanted to be in control of my career. And I've seen certain colleagues who have stayed in those roles for quite a long time. And then they just got beyond their sell-by date and sort of moved on, sometimes somewhat unceremoniously. And I thought, I don't want to do that. And it was actually, if I look back at my career and what's defined my career, there's obviously that moment I talked about earlier, but I had some fairly major surgery in 2014. So I had open heart surgery. Wow. So I was born with a hole in my heart which needed to be closed. So I was quite well at the time, but they had to perform this fairly major surgery. So I was off work for 4 weeks, not 4 weeks, 4 months even.
That'd be impressive.
Yeah, and that was actually, I look back and that was a really good experience because I learned a lot about myself. I learned a lot about what was important to me and my life. It was actually really helpful being a patient and experiencing things on the other side of the divide, as it were. And it was during that time I had off work that I really sort of crystallised my thinking about what I wanted to do in my career. And that's when I decided I wanted to become chief executive. And then soon after I got back, there was an opportunity to apply for a job down in Somerset. Being frank, I'd never really thought about working in Somerset. Somerset was a county I knew nothing about, apart from the fact you drove through it on the way to Devon and Cornwall. But it was a fairly small trust, a community mental health trust. They wanted a different style of leadership. They were very keen to have a clinician at the helm. So I applied for that post and was successful. And I joined Somerset Partnership in early 2016.
Fantastic. I'd love to hear a bit more about that. I just wanted to sort of pause on your so one of the things that's coming through is you at many times in your career have taken these moments of reflection, whether imposed on you by operations or do you feel like a self-reflective person? Because that's often described as one of the really key attributes that you need when you get into leadership, because you have to be able to look at how you're performing, how you're feeling, and take the time to think about the choices that you're making.
Yeah, most definitely. And I often say when I'm talking to people, I provide some sort of leadership training to junior doctors and to the medical students, and I often say the most important piece of furniture in the room, if you want to be a leader, is the mirror. No, I don't say that because I'm incredibly vain, but I think, metaphorically speaking, it's really important that you constantly reflect on the impact you're having, how you communicate things, how you perform, and that's how you learn. So following this, Philippa, I will reflect and think, well, was that as good as it could have been? Did I come across as well as I would like to come across? Have I helped to inspire people? I don't know. But the more senior you become, the more you want to try and ensure that every interaction you have has the desired effect on the people you're with and around.
You have to be very conscious, don't you, and deliberative in the steps that you're taking, in the way you communicate and those choices, I think.
Most definitely. Yeah. And I'm very conscious when I come into work that, people take notice of how I behave, how I appear. And if I walk past you with my, with a scowl on my face and avoid eye contact, that won't have a particularly positive impact. Whereas if I stop and say, Philippa, how are you? How's your weekend? That will have a very different impact.
And the impact of leaders resonates more widely, I think.
Yeah.
So that's really important. And the other point that I thought was interesting is, so you talked about these break moments, and I remember feeling similar. I had a couple of maternity leaves, and just sometimes it's really helpful to just get that space, whether it's some annual leave or a day off or a longer period, career breaks, etc. It's really important to do, but it sometimes feels like work is getting busier and busier. And really difficult to kind of build in that time for reflection, perhaps for training or personal development, or even just rest and recuperation. And actually, we asked for some questions for you before this conversation. And one of the questions was about self-care and how you look after yourself and how you build in that sort of personal resilience in what must be quite a difficult role with a lot of responsibility on your shoulders every day.
I enjoy my work, so that's important. So, whilst I don't necessarily always spring out of bed on a Monday morning thinking, yippee, the alarm's gone off, time to get to Sandford Gate, when I get to the office, very rarely do I not enjoy what I'm doing. So I think that's important, and I know I'm very lucky to enjoy my job as much as I do. I suppose my approach is that there are 168 hours in the week. That's quite a lot of time. And we only spend, even we have very busy jobs, a minority of our week actually working. So that gives you a fair amount of time to do other things. I'm reasonably good at sort of compartmentalising. So, if I do take work home, I'll ring fence the time I spend working at home and make sure there's time to do other stuff. I'm happily married, I've got 2 kids, they're grown up, but my family's important to me. Lola, the golden retriever, is very important to me, and my time with Lola is always quality time.
Yeah. Dogs are good like that.
They're fantastic. They are, and running with Lola through the fields of South Oxfordshire is one of my great pleasures. I try and keep reasonably fit, and I do really enjoy running. So. When I run, sometimes I problem solve and, dictate in my head my next blog. Other times I think about nothing, and I find that quite helpful. Sometimes it's great not to think. Other times it's really helpful to think. Bit of exercise, friends, family, reading. I'm very passionate about reading, and I find that quite stimulating and sometimes, quite a very good way of just managing challenges that I have. So various things.
That's good. Very busy. So let's come back to that first big promotion to chief executive then. Does the role of chief executive feel different in your experience to other types of leadership role? Just because ultimately the buck stops with the chief exec, doesn't it, for that organisation?
Yes, and it felt very different to being a medical director. So as a medical director, you're almost a subject matter expert. The stuff that you're responsible for, you typically know a fair amount about. You suddenly become chief executive and you're responsible for an entire organisation and everything that goes with that. So not just sort of the clinical side of things, but also the financial side of things, workforce, etc., etc. So almost overnight, I found that I was responsible for stuff, being frank, I knew very little about. And that is a different type of challenge. Wasn't without its anxieties, particularly I was in a new organisation where I didn't know anyone. So, I had to make some decisions very quickly about whether the people who I had in my team, who were in charge of the money, who were in charge of the workforce, etc., were people I had trust and confidence in, and could therefore delegate responsibilities to. I was lucky; it was a pretty good team. The individuals were all very good. They just didn't really gel as a team.
Right.
So that was a challenge that actually felt quite doable, and I felt reasonably equipped to take forwards. But it's getting back to your question. It's a very different job.
And are there any sort of types of people you think are best suited to those roles, or do you think it's something that can lend itself to different styles of leadership?
Yeah, there are lots of different personalities in chief executive positions, and in some ways I'm pretty unusual for the NHS in that I'm medically qualified.
Yeah.
There aren't many doctors in these sort of roles. There are far fewer who've actually been chief execs in more than one organisation. Lots of our chief execs, I think, tend to work their way up through a sort of operational route, and clearly my career, although I did have some operational responsibilities as a medical director, I didn't have that many in the scheme of things. I think there's no one perfect fit for the role. I think what you need is to be able to manage uncertainty, because there's a fair amount of uncertainty to manage. B, you need to be able to lead a team effectively and have a good understanding about what are the conditions that should be in place for teams to flourish and develop. I think communication is a fundamental requirement, because so much about what I do is about communication. So there's no point me having the best ideas in the world about how Bob can develop. Not that I have the best ideas in the world, but you need to communicate your thinking to the people around you, to the people who you need to follow you, because essentially leadership is about you're an effective leader if people follow you, and people will not follow you. They won't buy into what you're trying to do unless they understand what you're trying to do. So communication, both verbally and in written form, I think is a very important skill.
Yeah, I find that's one of the challenges across Bob, actually, because we are geographically huge. We have lots of different offices in different places. Now we've got hybrid working, some people basing in providers and other bits of the health and care system. It's quite challenging. Just even something simple like communication isn't always simple in Bob, I think. And it'd be good to kind of get your sense of system working now. So now you've kind of moved to being a chief executive of not an organisation but a whole system, really. And how you sort of manage that even bigger complexity, even bigger uncertainty, I think, that comes with system working. And you talked a bit about trust and building trust in your team. And for me, at Place, as Place Director, that's one of the things that feels really important to cultivate is trust and transparency in our dealings with other people to support that partnership working. But I'd really be interested in your thoughts on leadership, system leadership, as opposed to organisational leadership, and how that's different again.
Yeah, you're right to highlight that, because it is different. And I suppose what I found interesting and at times challenging in relation to this role compared to, say, the Oxford Health role, is that if you're leading a trust, it's relatively straightforward to sort of almost put your arms around the organisation and to understand what the organisation looks like, where people are based, etc. This is a far more disparate and nebulous entity, actually, in part because it's a new construct. I think we're still trying to find our feet, as all the other systems and all ICBs are, and probably we're not as ahead in the game as many of the others are because of events and maturity, etc. So it is tricky. So much of it comes down to actually building relationships, getting to know people, getting to know what they're trying to do, what the challenges are within their organisation, building trusting relationships so you've got confidence in each other. That relates to the importance of having clarity of purpose, or what are we about, what are we trying to do, how are we trying to do it. And there's a communication challenge.
And can I also draw on some of that, because I think in building those relationships, we also want to be inclusive and recognise diversity and make sure that we're reaching out and bringing in different groups. Is that something that's important to you, or that you think we should be working harder on in Bob?
So this comes back to the cultural piece, and it's about the culture in our organisation. It's about the culture in the system we work in, the culture at across the three places that form our system, etc. And it's really important that we are inclusive. But it's important that we think about inclusivity in its entirety, and are not overly simplistic in our approach. And for me, one of the things I'm very keen that we don't overlook is the importance of sort of cognitive diversity. I think we make better decisions when we have people who think differently contributing to that decision. And that's not just about people who are neurodiverse, it's about people who've just got a different view, who interpret the data differently and feel able to challenge. So the more cognitive diversity, the more different thoughts we have that we can distill down to help hopefully inform our ultimate decision making, the better.
And the NHS itself is really diverse, isn't it?
Yeah.
And actually, if you look at the plurality of roles, the different ethnicities and backgrounds, and all of that stuff that we've got in the NHS, it's a really powerful place to be.
It's an incredibly rich place to be as a consequence.
If you
of that.
can draw on all of that rich set of perspectives and experiences, I think it's really powerful, isn't it?
Yeah.
I've been asked, one of the other questions I've been asked to ask you is relating to the ICB. Is there anything that keeps you up at night? What do you think is your kind of big challenge, or the conundrum, or anything that you find particularly tricky when you're on your dog walking that you're thinking about?
So I think the thing I find the most challenging aspect of the job is how we can transform services and put them on a more sustainable footing, and at the same time deal with all the operational stuff, all the operational challenges that we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And that is difficult because there's a huge amount of pressure to sort out the waiting list, to sort out ED performance, to manage the money, to ensure in-year improvement. But at the same time, we need to start redesigning how services are delivered and need to make some pretty difficult decisions in relation to that. And I'm very much of the view that we need to be shifting resource, we need to be shifting people, focusing far more on prevention, doing far more in our community settings to support people more proactively and keep them out of hospital. And that's far more easily said than done. And that, I think, is the biggest challenge we have.
And I'm going to, I totally agree with that, and that feels like a 5-10 year challenge, doesn't it? I would like to end on a positive, which is to ask you to reflect on how you would like the staff in Bob to perceive you as a leader. What kind of leader do you want to be in Bob? What would you like people to say about you?
That's actually, it's a really interesting question. I would like people to respect me. Obviously, you'd like people to like you, but it has to extend beyond being liked. I would like people to see me as a really effective chief executive who is super strategic, who understands the operational challenges and focuses very much on the interpersonal dynamics that are so key, and someone who is really focused on culture and having the right culture across our organisation that ensures that everyone, no matter how senior they are, no matter what their background, professional or otherwise, feels engaged, valued and empowered. And I very, very firmly believe that culture is all important. If we get the culture right, lots of other things will fall into place.
I couldn't agree more. That's a great note to end on, and perhaps we'll come back to you in another podcast about culture. But thank you so much for doing this. This is the first time we've done one of these sessions, and it was great of you to volunteer to do it. So we really appreciate your time. Thanks, Nick.
Absolute pleasure, and thank you very much. Thank you.